Hi, my name is Avi Stamen from Academic Language Experts, and thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today on the 5 keys to publishing your academic paper. I really appreciate that you're taking the time in order to watch the webinar, and I hope that you can learn some things about the publication process and get some tips in order to make that process more effective. What we're going to do today in the webinar is we are going to cover a series of topics that are critical for every paper, no matter what field, no matter how senior an academic you are, that are really important when it comes to wanting to publish your paper, and it's important to be able to do them right. And sometimes these are big issues which take a lot of our time, and sometimes they're little things which we may have overlooked previously, which can help us improve the chances of publishing our paper in the journal or with the book publisher of our choice. Now, before we get started, I just want to direct everyone's attention to the Q&A feature up at the top. In case you have any questions throughout the webinar, you're welcome to press that button and we will do our best to address them as soon as possible. Before we begin, a word about Academic Language Experts. I founded ALE in 2011 with the goal of helping academic scholars translate and publish their research, translate and edit their research for publication. So we help scholars for whom English is not a first language, as well as scholars that are looking to translate from English into other languages. We help them translate. We can edit a text that's written in English. And we also provide formatting services. So if you need to format your paper or your book according to a specific style sheet, you can do that. You can send that to us and we can take care of that for you. Excuse me. My details, my information are right here. Feel free if you have any questions or you want to discuss further at a later point, feel free to contact me with any questions or queries you may have. Now, I want to start off by discussing what are the main goals. Why is it that we publish our research? Why is it that we need to write up that which we study? So the first and main goal is we want to be able to spread our research to a global audience. And what I mean by that is that it's important that if we're writing in a foreign language, or even if we're writing in English, that our research does not sit on our laptop. And then it gets to the places that we need it to get to. So oftentimes our research may have practical ramifications for different fields or industries. And it's important for us to understand that if it stays in a local forum, the impact that it could potentially have is limited. In addition, oftentimes we want to pursue partnerships with other scholars in our field from around the world. And it's important for them to be able to access our research and understand it. Now, in order to do that, we need to publish, and we need to publish in English. Whether we like it or not, 80% of the research in the world nowadays is published in English and is written in English. And we'll get to that later on, how exactly we deal with that fact for those of us for whom English is not a native. Now, in addition to impacting our field and spreading our research, we need to think about what I like to call the pragmatic side of publishing, which is career and promotion. Nowadays, one of the main criteria or factors, if not the main factor, in determining our career advancement and promotion as scholars is how much we've published, how often we've published, and in what journals or in what fora have we published in. And the answer to those questions can often determine whether we're appropriate or for a specific position, or if we need to publish some more in order to maybe get to where we need to get to in our careers. Now, I want to discuss for a minute why it is that it's so difficult for us to publish our paper. I want you to take a second before you take a look at the list here and think about what challenges have you faced in trying to publish your paper? What obstacles and roadblocks have you run into which have maybe made it difficult or frustrating to publish your paper in or your research in the fora that you would like. And I listed a few of the major challenges that I hear when I give this presentation at universities and colleges around the world. So I often hear some similar themes. First of all, we need to come up with a novel thesis or idea. The goal when we're writing our paper is not to regurgitate things that others have written previously or that we ourselves have written. However, this isn't always so so simple. For example, it can be challenging to know all the full range and scope of research that's out there in our field. Oftentimes, the research may be written in another language, and we may not have access to it or easily understand it. But even if it is in our language, just trying to map out what is currently being researched and what others are working on can be a big challenge. And unfortunately, what happens is that sometimes we're working on something and someone else is able to publish on a very similar, if not same topic before us, and then we're sort of stuck with research that's no longer novel. The second problem, the second challenge that we face, which we may not always be aware of, is the competition. And it can be difficult to assess the competition because we don't really know necessarily who else is submitting to the same journal or who else is up for publishing in the same book publisher that we want to. But that being said, it's important for me to emphasize that approximately 80 to 85% of submissions to respected, well-known journals are rejected. And that's important for us to understand that what we need to do when we're submitting our paper for review is give ourselves the best opportunity and the best chance to be able to overcome those challenges, be able to stand out from the competition, and really make an impression on the reviewers. And we'll discuss a little bit later on how we can go about doing that. The third challenge that scholars face is the process of peer review. And that can be one which can be extremely infuriating or frustrating, especially for young scholars who aren't used to the process. We have worked months, maybe years, on a specific piece of research, and it is reviewed by one of our colleagues who we may or may not know who that individual is. And then all of a sudden, there could be significant criticism or challenges to our approach, to our theory, to our findings, and we are either told that our paper is not accepted, or in a better scenario, where we understand from the reviewers that they need us to make certain changes and corrections and fixes in order to have our paper considered in their journal. And oftentimes this can really throw us a curveball in the sense that we thought we were at the end of the process, maybe, of publication, whereas really, if we look at the cartoon on the left, which I thoroughly enjoy because it basically depicts a scholar going to submit his paper and talking about the streamlined process is quite an improvement. So as we see here, even those processes that work well still can be very challenging and frustrating. And it's important for us not to give up hope, not to become disgruntled, and to understand that these peer reviewers are doing their work voluntarily. We'll discuss later on, excuse me, how we should respond to the peer review. But to understand that if we look at it in the right light, it can actually be very beneficial. One of the most common challenges that scholars that we work with face are linguistic challenges. There's no question that this is a big issue in the world of publication for those for whom English is not their native tongue. And the ability to express the ideas that we are presenting in our research can at times be as important as the research itself. And therefore, language is really critical and crucial. And if we go back to the idea of competition for a second, if we want to stand out from the crowd, presenting a paper, submitting a paper that has English that is not grammatically correct and that is problematic can actually work against us and can make the competition look on an even higher level than we are. So it's important for us to take those linguistic challenges seriously and to come up with an approach, not just as a one-time fix, but on a continued basis for how we're going to address whether we decide to write in our native tongue and then translate, or whether we decide maybe we want to write in English and have our English edited by a professional academic. Another challenge is the wait time and the process can be very dragged out. I saw a study recently that said that on average it takes about 6 months for a review to come back and another 6 months for a paper to be published. And that to me seems like even maybe a bit of an underestimate. So what that tells us is even from the minute that I finish my research and that I have submitted it and clicked the button and it's been sent off into cyberspace to the journal that I hope to publish in, it doesn't mean that we're going to hear back soon, and that doesn't mean that the process is over. Actually, the opposite. Oftentimes it means that we're just starting the process, and that it can take a year up to 2 years, sometimes depending on what field, depending on what journal. I'm going to jump ahead a second. An issue that we discussed a little bit later on is this is an important factor to consider when determining what journal we want to submit to, and that information sometimes is actually available to us online, meaning how long the process takes in a particular journal. So that's something that we want to keep in mind when we submit. And finally, referencing and sourcing and citing properly, creating our bibliography, whether it's footnotes, endnotes, and making sure that we do that in the most effective way possible so that we don't get stuck in a situation whereby we've been asked to format a paper according to a specific style sheet, and we don't have the information available to us, maybe on some of the references, and how to do that properly, how to properly prepare for that. In addition, we want to make sure that with referencing, we need to be up to date. And we need to make sure that our references are addressing literature that's still accepted in our field. Excuse my cough. Okay. What I want to give you here in the next slide is a cheat sheet, essentially. And this cheat sheet can be extremely helpful. And the reason I call it a cheat sheet is because we oftentimes are in the dark about why it is that our paper was accepted, rejected, asked for revisions. We don't know how the process works. And while we can never know exactly how the process is going to work for each and every one of our articles, we can turn to journal editors and reviewers and ask them, well, what is it that you like in a paper and what is it that you dislike in a paper? So I took this list from a scholar named Peter Thrower, who's a journal editor, and he gave his favorite 8 reasons why he rejects research or why he rejects submissions and what to avoid in the process. And I think that by understanding what we need to avoid, it can help us in trying to understand what we can and should do. Now, I know there are only 6 lines here that I included. I took the 6 that I think are really most critical, but I do invite you to click on the link and check out the full list as well as some other resources there. So first of all, it fails the technical screening, and this goes back to formatting that we just discussed. Now, we may be tempted into an approach that says, you know what, why do I need to worry about formatting and style sheets and author's guidelines right now? If my paper gets accepted, then I will worry about that at the proofing stage, at the very end of the process. And while that approach does sometimes work, and there are journals there are some journals that will overlook maybe some of the technical requirements if your article is on a high enough level. There are journals that won't. And there are journals that will send back your article if it's not prepared according to the author's guidelines, according to their request, and according to the style sheet. So if they ask for the Chicago Manual of Style, we need to be careful not to submit to APA. If they ask for AMA, we need to make sure that it's done properly. So that's really important. And again, I want to focus on standing out from others in the competition. And as soon as a journal sees a diagnosis or understands from your paper that you have spent time and energy and focus preparing the article specifically for their journal, and not just that you're taking your article, throwing some darts on the wall and hoping that something sticks, they more incentive and motivation to take your article seriously, to consider it seriously, and to potentially accept it for publication. The second issue is that it doesn't fall within the aims and scopes of the paper. And this is probably every scholar at one point in their careers has received a rejection letter or a revise and resubmit letter saying something along the lines of, thank you for submission, but it's not necessarily appropriate for our journal. So how do we avoid that? So number one is, on the journal's homepage, there should be some sort of description about their aims and goals and what sort of papers they want to be receiving. And that's one way, that's one obvious way to kind of be able to understand for ourselves whether this is an appropriate journal for our research. But that's only somewhat helpful, because oftentimes the goals and objectives are painted in very broad strokes, and sort of, we think maybe our article is relevant, maybe not, it's hard to know. So what I suggest doing, and I think that every good scholar, does this anyway, so I don't know if it's really a great piece of advice, but I'm surprised by how often people, don't think about this, and that is, go back and read the last volume or the last 2 or 3 volumes of the particular journal. What that will do for you, A, is it'll give you a feel and a sense for the particular journal, and B, it will give you an idea of what sort of articles are being written. And theoretically, if this journal is where you're submitting to, and it's obviously relevant to your research, you probably should have been reading those volumes anyway. But if you have not, that's definitely the first thing you should do, is to go back. And that'll give you a feel not only for the journal, but in general, but specific articles, what they're looking for, and maybe the specific leadership for the current board of the journal, what sort of things they publish. And that's why it's important to be current and to look at the last volume. Another reason that articles are rejected are that the procedures and analysis are seen as defective. And this is something which really falls on the scholar and on their advisor or on their colleagues to work together to make sure that is taken care of. And it's something whereby you need to make sure that when you're doing your research, it's accepted, the methodology that you're using is accepted in an international plane. And if there are challenges or issues with that, with your method, with the method that you've chosen to go about your research, you explain those, and you're very honest and open about those, and you don't try to hide. Another problem which journal editors just hate is that the conclusions aren't justified, or that they're blown up and exaggerated beyond what they should be. I remember receiving a paper once for editing that basically was a study of indoor learning versus outdoor learning, and trying to understand where students learn the most. And it was a fascinating paper, but it really covered 2 schools. There were 2 schools that were the subject of the research, and the conclusions were drawn from those 2 schools. Now, that in of itself was perfectly fine. The issue was that the scholar decided to basically extend the ramifications or the understandings from her paper and try to impose them on all sorts of other frameworks and schools in different countries, in different areas, which was problematic, and the article was eventually rejected because the conclusions of the findings went well beyond what the findings actually said. So there's no problem if your article has certain limitations or restrictions. Not all of us have an unlimited budget or the ability to necessarily study the way we would want to be able to study a particular topic. That being said, we need to be honest and straightforward and forthcoming with the journal editor, with the reviewers, and say to them, or write in our research essentially, here are the limitations of my research, and here is what I would like to propose as further research. And then you gain a certain level of credibility, and it actually has a positive effect on the remainder of the article because your level of reliability and believability has been raised. Another major issue is that that Peter Thrower elaborates on is that it's an extension of, your article is an extension of a different article. Now, I have seen, we have worked with scholars for many years, and I've seen scholars who will take their journal article, or they'll take their doctorate, excuse me, and they'll chop it up into many little different sections, and they'll use that for the next 5-10 years and try to publish as much as they can on the same topic, just writing it in different ways. Also, sometimes the scholars will take a text published in one language and try to translate it and publish it in another. I'm not here to tell you what the right approach is, but I will tell you that if it's too similar and if there aren't enough new findings in your new paper, you're going to have difficulty because a reviewer that's on the ball is going to say, you know what, I've seen this before, or it's just not novel enough in order to consider for its own publication. And last but not least is it's incomprehensible. And this is something which I'm always shocked to see the papers that we receive for editing. And sometimes they can be very difficult to understand. And the challenge is not only that get points taken away for poor writing. That's the less problematic issue. The real issue is that when a journal editor is reviewing dozens of submissions, and on yours, he or she may need to stop and consider, okay, what is he trying to say? What is the author trying to say here? So it takes away from the inherent argument or position or hypothesis that you're trying to establish. Because the reviewer needs to take the time to depict, excuse me, to take apart and understand what it is that you're even trying to say. And again, if we're trying to raise our chances of being accepted, this is going to harm us. So now, I've presented a very bleak picture of all the challenges and all the reasons that articles are rejected. And I hope that you've stuck with me until now, despite all of that, and I hope that you're not too down, because now what we're going to do with the rest of the session, of the webinar, is we're going to ask a very simple question. How do we reach the summit? How do we take that final step towards getting published? How do we overcome the challenges and the obstacles that we've raised, both in terms of our own experiences with publishing, as well as from the journal editor's perspective and what they see as problematic? How do we overcome those and be able to present a paper that's really ready for publication? And I want to just say one thing before we dive in, and that is that it's important to start thinking about this well before we even write the paper. When we're starting to do our research, we need to map these things out. We need to plan them out. If we wait until only after we've written the paper, it's not the end of the world, but it creates extra work for us. So these tips hopefully will be helpful to you no matter what stage you're at, but specifically when you're starting out with a new piece of research. Okay. Finding it hard to find a place to put me. These screens are so full. Hopefully you can see me and the screen and everything. Okay. First things first is when we go to write our research, and I specifically say before we start to write our research, we need to think about what journal we want to publish in. And sometimes this can come as a surprise to scholars who say, I'm going to just write down everything I know, or everything I've studied, or all my results and my findings, And then I'll worry later on about what journal to publish in. In my mind, that's a mistake. Again, you can overcome it. It's not devastating, but if we're trying to come up with the best approach long term, I would highly recommend thinking about the journal even before you start writing the research. What that enables us to do is basically have an audience in mind while we're writing. And anytime we're teaching our class, we're teaching our students sort of writing strategies or writing tips, we always tell them, who's your audience? That's one of our first questions. Who is the audience? Who are we writing for? So there's no difference here. We need to be thinking about who's the journal, what sort of articles are they accepting? Do they like more flowery prose, or do they want hard-hitting facts right to the point? How many words do I have available to me when I'm writing? And all of these things will help us plan out our article. Now, let's talk for a second, or for a few minutes really, about what should I be thinking about when I go to choose a journal? How do I make that decision? How do I find the right journals in the first place? So first of all, I want to direct your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, the blue, what's in blue, which is a lot of really helpful tools. You'll see the middle ones are finding journals, and there are also tools for finding impact factor and acceptance percentages, which we'll talk about in a minute. And these tools use with caution. What I would say is that they are like Google in the sense that they are searching based on keywords and based on important ideas that come up in your research. Sometimes you can just upload your paper and it'll give you some ideas of where to publish. Some of the ideas and suggestions can be right on, some of them can be totally off, and it's a waste of your time to even complete the application process. So use with a critical eye and scrutinize before you decide to go ahead with one of these journals. Also, finding some of these other journals may give you ideas for journals that they may quote that may be relevant. Okay, so what factors go into determining what journal I should submit to? Number one, most important, beyond everything else we're going to discuss here today, is it's critical to be able to match our paper with the interests of the journal. And we talked about this a little bit before when we were discussing the aims and scope, but I want to re-emphasize the match between the journal and our paper is critical. And it doesn't matter how revolutionary or how innovative our research is, if the journal focuses on a slightly different area, they're not going to accept our paper. So it's important that we think about that. And when we're writing with the journal in mind, it can help us be able to adapt our research to make sure that it matches the interest. Once we have done that, and theoretically, that's helped us narrow down the pools of potential journals that we can submit in. And again, it surprises me. Sometimes I hear scholars who tell me, oh yeah, my colleague told me this is a good journal, so I'm going to submit there too. Well, that's lovely and that's wonderful if you're working on the exact same research. If your fields are different, so that may not be of any relevance, the fact that your colleague could publish. So what are the other factors? So first of all, impact factor. Is a factor that I'm sure you've heard of and are familiar with. In short, impact factor is a method for determining the value of a journal based on the number of times that it is quoted and it is cited in other articles. Now, this method is, on the one hand, the most accepted method that we have for determining the value and the importance of any particular journal nowadays. On the other hand, it's also very problematic in the sense that the fact that an article is quoted in a particular place does not necessarily mean that it is quoted in a positive way. So, for example, if there's an article, if there's a new piece of research that is published, and there are a number of rebuttals in the next volume from different scholars who totally reject the new study out of hand for whatever reasons, it may be quoted quite often and raise the impact factor of the journal or the article. However, it's not really for the right reasons, and therefore might have the high impact factor, but not the solid article. That being said, there's no question that impact factor can give us some idea about which journals are well respected and are quoted a lot. And oftentimes, if we go back to our original goals, we want to get a promotion and move forward in our careers. Oftentimes, one of the methods for measuring our success in terms of publication is impact factor, is the impact factor of our articles, and therefore we need to take that seriously. Now, the next criteria is acceptance percentage, and this is one that's often overlooked, in my opinion, but should really be taken seriously. And what I mean by that is that the journals report, theoretically report, how many articles they receive every year and how many they publish. So, for example, a journal that receives 200 submissions a year and publishes 8 of them is going to be quite difficult to get into, and it's going to be quite difficult to get accepted to, even if our research is a home run. Whereas an article that, let's say a publication or a journal that publishes 50 articles a year out of 300 may be a better bet because 1 out of every 6 articles that's submitted is accepted. Sometimes this information is actually on the website of the journal, and they'll say we accept 20, 30, 40%, whatever it may be, of submissions. But there's actually some external sources as well, as you can see in the bottom right, acceptance percentages where some of those numbers are reported, and we can also ask for anecdotal evidence from our friends, from our colleagues, and ask them what sort of luck they've had in submitting to a particular journal. This should also be taken, tread lightly. This should be taken with caution, because, and I will explain this by a story. I was sitting next to a scholar at the National Library once, and the scholar received a phone call and stepped outside and was discussing, had a conversation with the Australian review board, which they determine which articles are, or they're one of the bodies that measure impact factor and acceptance percentage and collate and gather all this data for scholars to have at their fingertips in order to rank the different journals. And they asked him, what percentage of articles do you accept? And he told them 5%. And I was shocked by this because I know his field and his niche, and it's a very particular and small niche. And I was very surprised that he would accept 5%. And I asked him about it. And he said, no, of course I don't accept 5%. I accept 50%. So why did he say 5%? Because the lower the acceptance percentage, or at least the stated acceptance percentage by the journal, the higher rank, so to speak, the journal receives, which again is our way of currently measuring that criteria, but is also has its faults. I want to jump to number 5, or excuse me, I want to jump to number 6. Before we go back and talk about the speed of the response time. How long does it take for the journal to get back to us? And this can be really critical in determining where we want to submit to, especially for younger scholars at the beginning of their careers. It's really important to get some experience and to have some success and to get the ball rolling with publications. And I often hear from younger scholars, especially those who are in love with their baby, with their research, they want to go for the top. They want to shoot for the moon, and I totally get it, and I encourage it. On the other hand, if what that means is it's going to end up being a drawn-out, lengthy process with one of the top journals that will take 2 years, and at the end, there's a good chance that we may receive a rejection anyway, it's worth considering whether that's the best strategy, or whether whether we should first decide that we're going to go for some maybe level B, level C journals and have some success, get some feedback, get a publication out there, get our name out there, and be able to move on to further research. Oftentimes, the articles that we're dealing with are research that we completed often many years ago. And to keep that healthy ball rolling is really important and critical. So I want to emphasize this speed of response time. Now, again, this data is not always available to us, but sometimes it is, and it's worth looking into it and seeing if we can find that information in order to have that available to us when we determine. And my suggestion is that we don't take any one of these factors on its own. Rather, we take the impact factor, the length of the article, the impact factor, the acceptance percentage, and the speed of the response time, put those all together, make some sort of formula, and figure out for ourselves, okay, now where do we want to submit to? What makes sense? Now, an even more basic criteria, which I guess is a starting point, is the length of the article. And this is really important for authors who write in English, but as well as authors who don't write in English. When we sit down to write an article, we need to know what are the boundaries. Is there a minimum size for the article, a maximum length, and make sure we're writing according to the length that's being requested. So one example that I'm familiar with is when it comes to translating, which comes up very often, is that when translating from Hebrew to English or from Arabic to English, there's a jump. There's a significant jump in the number of words in the English. So, for example, if there's an article of 8,000 words in Hebrew, oftentimes it'll end up being 12,000 in English. Now, that's fine if we have a journal that's willing to accept 12,000 words. But if we have a journal that's only willing to accept 10,000 words, and all of a sudden we have an article that's 12,000 words, now we have a little bit of a predicament. We can theoretically edit it down, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend using that as a strategy from the outset. But it's important to have that in mind so that when we're writing our original manuscript, our original article, we know what we're aiming for in terms of length, so that it will be within the framework of the journal. I want to go back to number 4 for a second. That's what I like to call rejection as a strategy. And this is something I learned from one of my clients who told me that she submits all of her articles to one particular journal with the understanding and knowledge that they will not be accepted to that journal. But she does this anyway because she loves the feedback. They get fantastic feedback. Now that's her strategy for success, and then she goes and submits it to the journal that she wants to submit it to and has a high degree of success. I'm not saying I recommend this strategy, but I think it's important to think about it, and it's interesting in that we need to not look at rejection as a negative per se, but rather a stepping stone in order to move on and to improve our research. And in fact, what's really interesting is I saw a study recently which said that papers that are rejected and then submitted to a second or third journal and then accepted there actually end up having more citations than papers that are accepted on their first try. And this is very logical. This makes a lot of sense when we think about it, but it's sort of counterintuitive in the sense that we want our papers to get accepted right away, but actually they do much better once we get some really great critical feedback and review. So to understand rejection as part and parcel of the process, but again, this goes back to speed of response time. Quick, we want quick rejections. We don't want to wait 2 years before we get the rejection. Another idea is reaching out to the editor, which again, I do not recommend, but I recommend considering. If there's someone on the editorial board that maybe we know that we can reach out to and just pitch our idea before we make an official submission to the journal and just say, here's what I was thinking in terms of submission. Do you think this would be a good idea? Do you think that your readers would be interested in it? You know, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Some editors do not like this and they won't answer you, or they'll send you a curt reply. Some of them won't mind, and some of them may say yes, may say no. What can be very helpful is if you get a no, then you don't waste your time with the whole submission process, and sometimes B. And that brings us to number 8, which is open access versus subscription-based model. And we could have an entire webinar just on this topic alone, and we're not going to do that, obviously. But it's important to be aware of what the different models are. Open access essentially was created, is a movement that started 5 to 10 years ago, that basically says we want to put a stop to these giant paywalls and these really expensive paywalls that stop us from being able to read and get access to the research that we need in order to understand what's going on in our field. And oftentimes libraries need to pay exorbitant amounts of money to different publishing companies in order to access the paper. So open access comes and says, okay, the financial burden is no longer going to be on the reader. It's actually now going to be on the scholar who's publishing. So as a scholar who wants to publish, we need to pay. Sometimes it's a small amount, anywhere from $200 to $2,000, in order to, if our paper is accepted, in order to have it published. And that way, other scholars who are coming to read our paper won't need to pay for it. There's a lot more to discuss in terms of which sort of journals are better, right? Open access versus subscription-based in terms of the quality of the journals. I will say that there are open access journals on a very high level. So if you've heard that open access journals are not serious, that's not necessarily true. It depends on what journal you're applying to. I will say that there are what are called pirate journals that are out there, which basically take your money and pretend to publish your paper, but don't really. So be careful of those. Keep your eye out for them. And one last thing before we move on is that it's important to think of for open access, which I just learned recently, is that it's cited and quoted a lot more than the subscription-based models, and that makes a lot of sense. It's viewed a lot more because there's no paywall. Therefore, scholars have access to it. Therefore, they cite these papers. And I believe the number is 4 times as often as papers that are behind a paywall. So that's also worth considering for thinking about the long term and our goal of being cited in other research. And be realistic, right? 80% of the articles that are submitted are rejected. So if we are rejected, in the unfortunate scenario that we are rejected, we're in good company. Not to get down about it, not to get despondent, but to raise our heads high and realize, okay, it's a roadblock. Let's use the criticism we've received and move on. Okay, I want to move on now to writing your paper. And this webinar is not going to cover writing tips, strategies, going through what is an academic paper and how to write it. That would be a webinar on its own. And I hope that you have some writing courses in your college or university that can help you with that. What I want to discuss are some of the issues surrounding writing your paper, which I think are important. First of all, writing with your target audience in mind. We've harped on about this. We don't need to discuss further, but it's important. Writing concisely, especially in languages whereby there's going to be a big jump when we translate from our language to English. It's important to write concisely, to be aware of how many words are in the article. Following the style guide and making sure that not just with sometimes people think style guide is for references and for bibliography. That's not true. Style guides cover issues relating to commas, quotation marks, indents, how to cite different sources within the article itself. So it's important to at least review a summary of the style sheet that we're using in order to write the paper accordingly. Creating our own reference list, especially using reference software. And maybe I'm doing myself an injustice here because part of the services that we offer are organizing references according to specific style sheets. But despite that, I still recommend that you go out there and purchase some reference software, whether it be Mendeley, or Zotero or EndNote. It doesn't really matter. It's important to start using some of these tools. And basically what the tools do, just to give you a little bit of an insight, is you essentially create a library of the references that you use, or any references that you want that would be in your bibliography. And once they're stored in there, first of all, you can complete missing information sometimes for some of the sources. But even more powerful is if, let's say, you have them in a certain format and then you're told you need to switch them into a different format, or you want to submit to a different journal that asks for a different formatting style, in one click you can do that, as opposed to dozens of hours trying to go through and by hand and reorganize it. So look into those and see if they can help you. Doing your own peer review. This is something which I can't recommend highly enough. And what I mean by that is that You should not, the first person that looks over your paper besides for you should not be the journal editor or a reviewer. It definitely needs to be one of your peers, one of your advisors, someone in your close vicinity. And what saddens me is that oftentimes I hear from scholars that they don't want to share their research with their colleagues because they're worried about where their research is going to end up or whether it's going to be published behind their back. And I understand that point, and it's legitimate, and it has happened. That being said, I still think I still believe it is crucial to go about getting peers and colleagues to review our work for us. And here's how I suggest doing it. Number one is we need to think about someone who is trustworthy and is believable and is someone who we know will not take our research and use it for their own benefit, but we'll be able to give it a critical eye and give it a real intense review. That's number one. So it's got to be someone in our close circle. Number two is it's got to be a two-way street. It never works long-term if they're doing all the work for us or we're doing all the work for them, and it doesn't go vice versa. And it also helps mitigate this maybe, I don't know, hidden dark motivation to take from other people's research. If we know that we're sending our research to our colleague and they're sending it back to us, then there's this two-way street, and it's beneficial for both sides. It can be very helpful. The other thing I would say is think about critically if there's no one in your department, maybe there's someone outside the country, someone you've met at a conference in your field, who their perspective, their external perspective, for someone who comes from a different setting, from a different environment, could be very helpful to you in making improvements and changes to your paper. Regardless, find someone you trust and deposit your paper with them before you send it along. You'll be amazed how much that can improve your writing. And last but not least, I want to direct your attention to the bottom right corner, which is a very, very simple image, which says 1,000 words. And it depicts what journal editors look at. This was actually based on a study of journal editors, and they asked them, okay, when you receive a submission, what exactly are you looking at? So if you see here, the vast majority of journal editors, are looking at the title and maybe the abstract. And that's it. And when I say that, I mean, if they aren't blown away by the title and the abstract, they're not going to read the whole paper. You see how few people are actually, a few editors are actually reading the entire paper. It's a bit depressing, actually. But what that tells me, in terms of strategically how to go about it, we need to make sure that our title and abstract are killer, to the point, get everything we want to say out there. We're not going to leave anything mysterious. If we have some conclusion that's going to make an impact, we throw it out there at the beginning. We come up with a creative title, something that's going to catch their eye, something that's professional, that the editor will be impressed with. And so oftentimes, scholars forget about the abstract, that they even need to write an abstract till the last minute. They throw something in there, send it away, and then wonder, well, why wasn't my paper accepted? And a quick LB, the paper wasn't even considered. So let's make sure that doesn't happen to us and work carefully on the title and the abstract. I do recommend doing that last, by the way, after we have our entire paper well written, but don't leave it until the last minute where we're going to be stuck writing something very hastily. Okay, the next key out of the 5 keys, the third key to success in academic publishing, especially for scholars for whom English is not a native language, are how to go about the process of professional translation and editing services. And full disclosure, this is really based on our own experiences working with scholars on their research. And I try to melt it down into the real critical points that I think are crucial for success. First of all, I wrote when translation just isn't enough. The answer is translation never is really enough. What I mean by that is as follows. If you write your text in your native language and you want to translate it to English, how do you go about doing it? So first of all, it's important to understand that an English-speaking colleague, a neighbor, a cousin, a friend who went abroad for a few years to an English-speaking country is not enough to provide a high-level academic paper. It's as simple as that. Professionals have trained to do this work. They have experience doing this work, and they've learned from their vast experience working on academic papers. You may think that you're saving some time and money by getting, an English colleague to do it. It may end up costing you more time and more money. And that is because translation is a very delicate balance. There's a balance between, on the one hand, being very true to the source and not straying from it and creating a totally brand new text. And on the other hand, creating a text that flows and is comprehensible and understandable in the target language. And not just understandable, but written at a very high academic level. And that balance, the art of translation, as I call it, is really something which is gained over time and experience and is learned by professional academic translators. Now I want to take one step further. Even a professional academic translator might not be the right answer if they're not an expert in your field. So, for example, with us in ALE, whenever anyone sends a paper in sociology, let's say, or in internal medicine, we make sure that the translator or the editor, for that matter, that's working on the paper comes from that specific field. And the reason for that is because if a translator does not fully understand the source text, it will be impossible for them to properly translate or edit it into the target language. And it will end up creating a lot of extra time and heartache for the author that needs to go through and basically revise and edit it himself. Now, in addition to everything I said now, even when you find a professional translator who's a professional academic translator with experience and knows your field, and that's wonderful and that's great. They also need an editing and revision. And the reason for that is because for the same reason that if you write a text in your own language, it benefits from editing and revisions, even more so with translation. There's oftentimes remnants of the original that are felt in the translation. There can be times where there are little things that are missed, nuances. And therefore, it's important to get a second editor. If that's something that you can do on your own, that's great. But if not, then to consider having someone else do revision editing. For example, in ALE, the way we handle this situation is we actually, on every translation project, there is a separate translator and then editor. So there's a subject expert translator who works on the paper, and then there's an editor who does a full edit of the entire paper to make sure that it flows and reads well and is accurate in the target. It goes without saying that obviously you should be working with native speakers of the target language. So for translating from Italian to English, the translator should be a native speaker of English. Obviously, for editing, whatever language the paper is being edited must be done by a native speaker. And one really great way to do this, which is very accepted in the translation and editing profession, is ask for a sample. Either ask for previous papers that they've worked on, which is a great indication if someone has helped other scholars publish, translate, edit numerous papers. That's a really good sign. But look over them yourself, see if you like the style. And in addition to that, you can ask for a sample on your own research. So you can give them your research, or a short sample. I wouldn't go overboard. We want to be fair to them and say, can you just translate this paragraph, edit this paragraph, so I can get a feel, I can get a sense of what's going on before I put down whatever money it is, or investment, or time and energy to make sure it's being done. Now, that's all in terms of finding the right translator and editor and understanding the process in order to produce a paper that's ready for submission. There are also things that you can do, which I really highly recommend you doing, which can make, once you have chosen that translator or editor, which can make the process simpler and smoother, both for them as well as for you. The first thing to do is always send a finished paper. Don't look at the translation or editing process as one stage in a process whereby you're going to go and redo things later. That may happen as a result of review from reviewers, but send a paper that's as finished, as complete as possible. That gives the scholar, excuse me, that gives the translator, the editor, the ability to produce the highest level text. If it's only half-baked in the original, don't be surprised if it comes back half-baked in the translation. Give it specific instructions regarding the level of intervention. And what I mean by that is that, as we discussed before, there's the two pillars. There's being true to the source text, and there's creating a comprehensible and understandable and clear target text. And those two can butt heads oftentimes. So it's important that if we have a specific preference, we want them to be a little bit less literal, a little bit more literal. We want them to use creative license and rewrite it. Or on the other hand, we really want them to stick to what we're originally writing. And that can depend on the field as well. Make sure we need to express these things and communicate them to our language expert before we begin work. Provide all the formatting and style guidelines from the beginning. Don't wait until the end. It's doubling work for no reason. And if you do know what journal you're going to be sending to or what publisher and their requirements, pass those on to the translator or the editor. Prepare a glossary of key terms, right? Oftentimes, ironically enough, the most challenging part for the translator or editor are the specialized, very unique and niche terms that they may not know, which you actually do know, and are easy for you because you've read all the research and you're familiar with the terms. So you have two options. Either you can write a glossary, a separate glossary, which is helpful. You can also just, the first time a term comes up that you know what you want it to be translated as, just put it in parentheses, and that way the translator will know what you prefer. Especially if there are alternative translations. I mean, if this one word can be translated multiple ways, why waste the time for them to get it wrong and redo it? Just put the term in there. It'll take you 5 minutes. Writing in your native tongue versus writing in English is a big debate that I know scholars have internally. And what I would say is as follows, or at least this is what I tell our clients, is that if you are going to write in English, it needs to be of a basic enough level, or good enough level, that I can understand what you're trying to write in order to be able to improve it. If the paper is going to be so challenging to understand that the editing is going to be problematic, then you're really running into a problem. And if you're having problems expressing yourself in a language that's not your native language, then it's really okay to be able to write in your native language and have it translated and edited. At least that's in my opinion. There's nothing to be ashamed of in that. And you only have, as I like to say, you only have one mother, you only have one mother tongue. So it may be worth considering writing in your native language and then getting a real professional to work out the kinks to complete the translation. On the other hand, if you spend considerable time in an English setting, your English is of a high enough level, it may be worthwhile, especially to improve for the long run, to write in English. The other thing is pricing. In general, I would say, as a very general statement, translation is about double the price of editing, so editing is about half the price of translation. So there is a money factor here as well to consider. If we're already talking about money, so we should talk about funding. We need to make sure that we know what's available to us in terms of funding opportunities. And that may be within our university, and that may be outside of our university. And oftentimes, the cost of translation, especially for books or longer articles, is well beyond what our department is willing to pay for. And unless we want to pay out of pocket, which we can pay out of pocket, it's important to start exploring those funding opportunities. We work with a few different scholars who are what I like to call the king of funding. They just are constantly applying for grants and funds. They know how to put together a proposal, and some of them even send us money before they even have projects. They say, here's money that I got for funding, for translations, for editing, and just keep this until I'm ready to send you an article. Send us an article, and we complete it. But that takes time, it takes energy, but it also can help with this process. And finally, give the language expert time. If it took you 2-3 months to write the article, don't give the translator or the editor 2-3 days. Give them enough time. Ask them how much time they need, and give them that time in order to work properly. Plan ahead so that you're not rushing things at the last minute. All too often, scholars don't appreciate how long it takes in order to prepare a document properly, in order to translate, in order to edit, and it ends up not being done as well as it maybe could. All right, we're in the home stretch here of the webinar, and I appreciate you for hanging on until now. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about writing a winning cover letter. Now, first of all, before we get into that, you're not always required to write a cover letter. So the first thing you need to do is clarify whether a cover letter is relevant for your specific proposal submission or not. That being said, there will be times that you'll either want to write a cover letter or you will be required to. And it's important to understand what should be included and what not. And these are very generic. Obviously, these guidelines and instructions that we're going to talk about. Obviously, if the journal tells you what they want in there, ignore what I'm about to say. But if the journal does not say what they are interested in seeing, there's some do's and don'ts. So number one is include your basic biographical information, right? After all, we're humans communicating with other humans, even though it may be via cyberspace. So what's your name, your position, your university, your basic details that qualify you in order to be making an inquiry in the first place. The title of your paper, just so that they get a little bit, just so that they get a little bit of a teaser in terms of what you're going to be telling them about. And finally, thank you. Don't forget to thank you, regardless of whether these reviewers are being paid, not being paid. They're putting time and energy into reviewing your work, and make sure that you express your appreciation for that. Now, what not to include can be as important as what to include. First of all, don't start asking questions about how long it's going to take, what the process is, or I would say in general, anything that's mentioned in the author's guidelines. If it's mentioned there, don't ask about it. It shows that you didn't take the time to read through and to take their instructions seriously, and that's not an impression that we want to make. Do not start giving a summary of your research. Don't throw your abstract in there. You'll have an abstract for a reason that's either part of the article or separate, but it's not, the cover letter is not the place for that. The abstract should be separate. If you give them too much of a long-winded explanation, they may just gloss over and not read it. And most importantly, don't use poor language. If you've spent a lot of time and money and energy into perfecting the manuscript and writing it and reviewing it and editing it and translating it, do the cover letter as you should. And I'll say even more than that. I know, with us, anytime that we have a scholar who needs to write a cover letter, I do that for free. ALE does that for free, just as a service. It's important to me that you don't mess up with the cover letter, as we saw before. It really can be critical, along with the abstract and the title. So next time you send a project, say, Avi, I want that cover letter. All right, the last key, and we've made it. We've made it to the point of submitting our article. We hit the submit button, and now everything's off. And now we cross our fingers and wait. And finally, after 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, we get review. We get a review, and we get critique. And oftentimes, it is very difficult to digest and challenging, because it may require a serious reworking of our article. It may be very critical. They may be harsh. And it's important that we know how to respond and use this as an opportunity to build from the critique and to improve our paper, and not to burn bridges, which can happen. So let's talk about the ABCs of professional communication, specifically in the context of responding to reviewers. Always be polite. Doesn't matter how rude they were. My mother taught me the Disney principle. Doesn't matter if Mickey is getting punched in the stomach, he always has to smile. And that's true here as well. Even if we're unhappy or disagree vehemently with the reviewer, we need to respond in a polite and PC manner. We need to be open to suggestions. And this can really help us. And I think it makes a difference between the really great scholars and the good ones. There are ones that can take the critique and take the feedback, learn it, understand it, and be able to implement it properly. And look at the review as sort of a blessing and as a really helpful opportunity for someone else to come in and say, here's what I like about your research, here's what I don't. and for us to be able to determine whether we agree with that feedback or not. And that takes us to the next point. C is critiquing the critique. Can we critique the critique? Can we turn around and say, Mr. Reviewer A, you don't know what you're talking about? So the answer is that yes, within limits. If there's nothing wrong with us turning around and saying, okay, I agree with points A, B, C, and D, but you know what? Point E, I actually vehemently disagree with because of the following factors. And if we do this in a respectable and transparent and open way, then I don't think we have anything to be afraid of, and I think it can only help our case. There's no benefit to just agreeing with everything or disagreeing with everything. We need to be balanced and we need to be critical at the same time. And we need to present our findings in an intelligent way and our critique in an intelligent way in our response. Sometimes some journals require a formal letter of response. Some of them require just making the changes within the article. Whatever it is that they ask us to do, we do. That's the golden rule. We follow their guidelines, we follow their instructions. That gives us the best opportunity of being successful. Take a deep breath. That's D. And maybe this should be A, but I'm not sure how we would get that into A. And this is something which is hard for us to do, but do not respond on a whim to the critique. Leave it at least 2-3 days before we respond. Take the time, try and approach it calmly in a collected manner, and turn around and say, like we said before, this is what I agree with, this is what I disagree with. And try to sandwich it, meaning start off with something you agree with, throw in something in the middle you disagree with, and then finish it with something you agree with and that you appreciate. And that, again, thanking them for their constructive feedback. E, establish if it's a revise and resubmit or rejection. Sometimes it can be a bit confusing. They send me feedback. I don't know whether they still want the paper or don't want the paper. There's no problem following up with the journal editors, asking them what they meant, asking them to clarify, understanding that even those responses may take time, but really establishing whether our paper has a chance or not. Sometimes we can read between the lines. We see that this has a small chance of being accepted. It may be worth our while to take the feedback, say thank you very much, move on to the next journal, especially if it's taking us a very long time to get the first initial review. Obviously, we're only allowed to submit to one journal at a time, so it's important for us to be transparent in that. That's it. We've successfully concluded the 5 keys. We've gotten through the 5 keys of successful journal publishing, or keys to success in publishing our academic article. I threw up here some resources that can be really helpful to you. We discussed Elsevier, we mentioned, is a really helpful tool, especially for younger scholars who are just starting out, want to understand how the process works. Mendeley, along with Zotero and Note, are great reference software programs. Maybe start with Zotero. It's a free one that's created by academics that can help you sort of organize your library of citations. It takes time to get into it, but once you do, it saves you tons of time in the future. ResearchGate and Academia, if you're not familiar, are basically social media platforms for academics to be able to share their research, to discuss issues, to open up drafts of papers for review, and to basically get ourselves out there. We need to promote it's not enough even to publish. We need to promote our own research and make sure that those who it's supposed to be getting to, we go back to our goal. We're trying to impact the world. We need to make sure that our research gets to the place it needs to get to, and we can't just assume that the publishing house will do that for us. So ResearchGate and Academia are a great way of staying up on research and getting exposure for our own research, and Google Scholar, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I want to finish with a quote that I really loved from an article that I saw recently that I think really kind of ties in the critical nature of language in everything in our research, and sort of drives home the importance of it. So it says as follows: science is never just about the data. The language in which we communicate affects our confidence and our ability to persuade, our expression of complex and nuanced ideas and information, and our judgments of the value of new ideas and their author. And the way I understand this quote is that it's not enough for us to do the experiments to run through the motions, but really we need to take the language and how we express ourselves as seriously as the researchers. That's it. We finished with the webinar. I thank you very, very much especially if you've gotten to this point, for sticking with us, for hanging in there. I hope that you've learned something today in the process. If there's something that I didn't cover or that you'd like me to go into more information or more detail on, please don't hesitate to be in touch and to send me an email, give me a phone call. I'm very accessible. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you have any translation or editing needs, please don't hesitate to be in touch.